Great. Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Welcome to today's Grazing Scholars webinar. My name is Col Phelan from MaiaGrazing, and it's an absolute pleasure to have participants joining us from all corners of the globe. Our presenters today need little to no introduction, with Bart, Davidson, and joining us from Australia, and Jim Gerrish from the US. There's a lot to fit in, so we'll get things underway shortly. So if people have any questions, simply follow the hand icon in your Zoom window, submit the questions, and if time permitting, we'll answer them at the end of each presentation. For those questions that we don't get to, we'll follow up after the webinar. Our contact details will also be at the end of the presentation if you'd like to make direct contact with us as well. We'll start with Bart in a moment, though here are just some events that are coming up through Australia, the US and Canada that we'd love to see you at if you're going to be visiting.
Right, rocking and rolling. Look, I feel a little bit like the teaser stallion, sorry, the teaser horse that comes out at the horse shows ahead of the stallion that gets the job done properly. And I won't muck around. I've been listening to people talking about Jim Gerrish for a while now, and I appreciate we've got people on the call and the conference here from the States and different parts of North America and the Southern Hemisphere too. So I'll try and balance the language and the lingo as I go. Really, I'm going to talk as a bit of a segue into Jim's talk following me. And I'm really just going to dive into a subject that has come up because I've been listening to people out in the paddock, some of our clients, talk about some of the stuff that Jim says. And one of the anecdotes I heard just recently was that you're better off doing better with what you've got rather than buying the neighbour's farm, because you go and spend a whole heap of money buying out the neighbour and not necessarily be any better off because you're underutilising the country that you've already got. And it just got me thinking, right, what does the data say? What does the data tell us? So that's what I'm going to dive into here and now. And like I say, I appreciate we've got people from different hemispheres on the call, and I'll just say off the bat that I did try and put my maths and numbers in some of the results into a bilingual, multi-unit, understandable sort of language, but found that I actually just needed to simplify it. So you'll see what I mean by that. And the one thing I haven't done is change paddock to pasture and pasture to paddock and feed to forage and grass to forage. So bear with me. It's all pretty simple. It's actually a really interesting subject because it really highlights to me that there's a whole world of opportunity here. So what I'm going to tell you in a nutshell is that, funnily enough, we've actually accrued a whole bunch of data in MaiaGrazing over the last few years. I think at the moment, it's probably the biggest data set to do with grazing in the world. And so we're pretty fortunate to be able to start looking at what that tells us. So today is really just having a bit of a dive into that data and having a look at subdivisions specifically to sort of work out what, if anything, they are trying to tell us about how we graze what we graze. And so I've rounded up a bunch of data on a bunch of farms all over the place, Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, intensive, extensive. And then we'll jump into a couple of specific examples. And ultimately, the point of all this is why buy the farm next door when you can try that little bit harder on your own place. So I'm determined to be on time today, and I'm determined to be short and punchy and allow us to go straight to the master himself, Big Jim. So I'm going to keep rocking. Just for those that don't know what we do, our reason for being is to turn data into decisions. So as I said, we essentially have accrued a data set that is all about supply and demand on the grass front, the relationship between that and animals and rainfall and land and people and various other things, turning that into analytics and then turning that into better decisions, because otherwise we're all just keeping busy and not really benefiting from the tools that are available to us. So that's our reason for being. That's what allows us to then do some of the things that we're talking about here. And I just got to thinking about subdivision and splitting paddocks up, which is really what my talk about here is about here today. And people go into, refining their grazing management for various reasons, what they hear, what they read, what they see. picking it up over the fence. And I think mostly though, it tends to come from well, for the better operators anyway, it tends to come from an intuitive sense of where their decision making takes them. And the best example of where that starts, I think, for those that have never seen one, is a grazing chart, because it's almost impossible. It's almost impossible to start thinking about who's going to graze what, when and where, without starting to think about the relationship between time and i.e. recovery periods for a particular paddock, how big that paddock is, how heavily I'm going to stock it, how much grass I'm going to take out, when was the last time that paddock had some rain, or for the time of year that we're in at the moment, and all of the things that go to thinking about where I'm at with the pasture I'm about to feed off and the implications of that, because we're all pretty busy people. There's a lot of people that can do this in their head, but ultimately the decisions to go and split country up and refine the grazing management tends to come from being more aware of the numbers. It's as simple as that. The more aware I am of my data about my paddocks and my animals that have been grazing that over the last probably 2 to 3 years tends to be how it works, then the more likely I am to realise that breaking those paddocks up into smaller areas gives me leverage over how I graze it. And that tends to come from the grazing chart. So my last big picture slide, I think, is just to talk about the relationships. So that's what we're trying to do here, and that's what we are doing, in fact, is building, fortuitously, relationships between these key fundamentals that drive the farm, ultimately on the grazing front, that, you know, we can't control the precipitation when it comes and how much we get, but we can control the recovery period between grazers. We can control the stock density, which ultimately dictates the yield of forage that we're taking out. And we're accruing a lot of data on this, which is really giving us the ability to then go diving in as we are now. So just to give a bit of perspective, that little chart on the left is representing a paddock per dot. So every one of those dots is a paddock in Maia with a different level of grazing intensity going on. And so we're accruing a good bit of data. And that particular graph is just saying, right, the bigger the paddock, the lower the result, which makes sense. You know, we've got some very large paddocks in MaiaGrazing out to a few thousand acres, all the way down to less than 1 hectare or part of an acre. So we've got a bunch of data. So actual events that start and finish have a relationship to rainfall. You know, the animals in that herd and mob for that particular point in time is all being captured, which means that there is real opportunity on the farm to then learn from our own data to see what it's telling us. So for this exercise, I said, righto, let's go and have a look at a bunch of paddocks that were, as it turns out, 655, that became 1,380 paddocks through the act of subdivision, where, you know, we've made a big paddock that little bit smaller by cutting it in half, or we've made a really big paddock into 10 or 3 or whatever the case might be, and leverage that single fence to get greater control over how we graze. So it tends to look a little bit like this. So I've just grabbed one particular farm, or 2 farms actually in the same business here, and just looking at change over time, where you can see there from left to right, we've got 44 paddocks over a period of time, then it goes to 60, and then it goes up to 77 odd paddocks, and the other farm, Wilmot, jumps up ahead of that. And that's a natural kind of progression that tends to evolve as people start to get hold of refining their grazing management. And the natural outcome is that the number of paddocks will tend to increase. So just to explain what I've done here before I jump into the numbers, just so you can kind of visualize how it looks. Pretty important to get it from that perspective. So I've dove into our 100,000 grazers in the database, and however many paddocks we've got now, there's thousands, and grabbed the ones that have got subdivisions that have been split up at a point in time, and found those paddocks that had graze history of at least 12 months prior to the point where the paddock was cut in half or into thirds or whatever the subdivision might have done. And also had at least 12 months of graze history after that point in time up till today, or in fact yesterday, which seems like a long time ago right now. And at the same time tracking, and so we're tracking that number via the mouths that are eating it, right? So we know that there's 5 sheep in that herd and there's 5,000 cattle in that herd over there that it might be grazing for 10 days or 1 day or 100 days. But ultimately, it's every conceivable type of graze event that's going on those farms that have had subdivisions. And gather up the amount of grass that's actually been harvested, not just the grass that's been grown, but gather up the total amount of grass that's been harvested through the mouth. I don't mean through the silage maker or the hay maker, through the mouth, what's being consumed by the graze and via the graze chart. And then, and in these examples I've got on the screen here now, I'm just showing metric and imperial because I know we've got people from both hemispheres on the call. So, you know, an example number would be a couple thousand kilos per hectare of dry matter that's being consumed, or 2,200 pounds per acre on the other. And most of the numbers are actually a lot higher than that, but I'm just using that for the simple maths of then saying, right, well, that's the grass that we consumed before and after. How much rain did we get? Or combinations of rain and snow and sleet and hail and everything else into precipitation, because ultimately we grew and consumed that feed on the back of precipitation, because these are dry land situations, not irrigation, and where they are irrigation, we're capturing that data as it was precipitation anyway. So it's the same deal, right? So we grew the grass on the back of rainfall. So we go and gather up all of that because we have those relationships, and then we say, right, well, if we consume 2,000 kilos per hectare of grass before the subdivision on the back of, for argument's sake, 1,000 mils of rain over however long it was, might be 12 months, might be 18 months. And therefore we've got 2,000 kilos of grass per hectare per 1,000 mils. And then we just take that back to a simple metric whereby it's 200 kilos per hectare per 100 mils, just so that it provides equivalence between farms and paddocks, and just makes it very easy to see where we're at over time. Because it doesn't matter how long that 1,000 mils took to fall, it still gives us a very honest appraisal of the grass that we've consumed over that period of time. To then compare it with after the subdivision, and I've done the same numbers there in Imperial, just so our friends in the States hearing us on the same numbers, although they're a different example, but just some numbers for context. You know, might have harvested 2,200 pounds per acre on the back of 20 inches of rain, which might sound like a lot to some of you, I know, and nowhere near enough for a lot of you as well. But that comes to 2,000 pounds per acre for 20 inches of rain. So therefore, we're growing and consuming 50 pounds per acre per inch of rain. The point of all that is that we're providing equivalence before and after the subdivision. And it's a pretty cool way of, just a very honest, brutal way of saying, how's our production system going per paddock, and per property for that matter, but in this case, we're looking at per paddock, within the paddock before and after subdivision, just so that I could explain that. I just wanted to explain that so that you understood how I come up with these numbers in the next couple of slides, because obviously it matters. So that's how I did it, and had to cull out a lot of data that didn't fit that criteria. But that's the point. Get rid of all the stuff that doesn't work. And rocking along, I'll just have a look at the area, the density and the yield. So the upshot of that group of paddocks that have been subdivided over that period of time is that the average is 125 hectares before subdivision, and which is 50 acres, being basically halved. Okay, so it's not quite half, so it's about 2.2 paddocks per original paddock is what's happened across all of those many farms around the world that we've been looking at. And what it tells us is that those people that are subdividing are typically in more intensive systems or zones. So this is telling me that there's less extensive grazing systems that are breaking paddocks up into smaller zones. although this is an average, so it's, you know, it needs a histogram to really nail that down. But we're looking here at the helicopter view, and okay, just to give you an idea of the kind of context that we've got. So we're taking 125 hectare paddock and making it 55, and the equivalent in acres is the actual result for all of the paddocks in Maia that's been subdivided. So then I was going to go and break this down into all the various different type of units that our various graziers use, and it did my head in, and it would have just confused you and made a very busy screen. So I thought about it and said, righto, let's just take it back to live weight, because that's a universal language. And the result of all of those subdivided paddocks is that the prior to subdivision, the average was 1,400 kilos per hectare, or 1,250 pounds per acre. You know, that's about 2 600 kilo cows, for argument's sake, or one very big cow-calf unit per acre. And if we then roll it up and have a look at what happened after subdivision through all those paddocks, it's basically doubling. So that the same number of head is grazing roughly the half the area. It's pretty logical that the density per metre, per square metre, per acre, per hectare, per paddock, in fact, is about double. It actually came out at about 90%, or at 90%. And it still feels to me a bit low, because anecdotally and observationally, I see loads of farms, both in Australia, New Zealand and the US and Southern America as well, where there is well and truly above 2,000 or 3,000 kilos per hectare or pounds per acre, you know, up in the 30s and 40,000 kilos and pounds per acre. So that surprised me a little bit, but I guess we've got a big subset of data here, and so it is actually averaging a lot of people in a lot of paddocks in a lot of different environments, and it's instructive, but it's also diluting that result. But it's instructive to see that basically for those that are actually splitting paddocks up, they're kind of taking incremental steps, and nothing outrageously huge there. I think Jim would say there's no way in the world that's near enough to get to the kind of animal impact and ecological change that we really want to see, but it's still pretty instructive, right? Because people are people, and they're on a journey to change, and things take time, but that's the actual result. So we're kind of doubling the weight of animal per square metre, per acre, per hectare through the actual subdivisions that have been recorded in Maia. So if I then say, righto, that's cool, what about the yield? What does that convert to? What's the result? I love the idea of increasing animal impact, but what's the result? And it comes out to be 180 kilos per hectare per 100 mils before, going up to 245 kilos per hectare per 100 mils after, which is the same as dry sheep equivalent and about 1/7 of LSUs. If I go back to pounds per acre, it's 40 odd pounds per acre per inch of rain, going up to 55 pounds per acre per inch of rain of grass, of forage, of green stuff, dry matter down the throat. So what does that mean? Well, if I'm looking at that as an Australian, I'm saying if I'm going from 180 to 245 DSE days per hectare, or the equivalent in stock days per hectare, or animal days per acre, that's a pretty good increase, actually. That's definitely meaningful. It's definitely something that is not done every day of the week. It's a really good, meaningful change. It's in fact 35%. Now, I didn't know what to expect when I went through the data. I thought it was probably going to be higher, but again, we're doing the average here of a whole bunch of people in a whole bunch of different environments with a whole bunch of different management experience and expertise and time and so on. So for it to actually be an average, I actually think it's probably pretty good, and it's probably about right. It's not outrageously over the top. And just to explain, that number is normalized for rainfall. So you're going to say, well, what if it rained more before or rained more after? Well, this takes into account seasonality. So this normalizes for seasonality. We might have gone from a drought into a wet time, or a wet time into a drought. This is factoring that out. So all in all, it's saying, you know, roughly 1/3 increase in production by splitting a paddock in half. You know, it took me days and days and days to get that number, and I was a little bit anticlimactic about it, to be honest. But I've kind of come around to the thinking that that's pretty cool, because that's not going to scare the horses. That's not going to, you know, change the world, but it actually will make it feel like it's a meaningful, possible opportunity to really get stuck into refining what we do without breaking the bank. So with that in mind, what does it cost? I could have spent an hour on this alone. So, and I'm going to wind up pretty quickly because I don't want to chew into Jim's time. And just to round out the numbers here, the basics are that people are spending about $100 a hectare or $40 an acre to put that fence that we just talked about down. Now, I've been on plenty of farms where they're doing it for $15, $20, $30 a hectare. And I've also been on places where it's $200 plus per hectare, and the equivalent per acre. So $40 an acre up to $100 an acre. And that goes back to ego and pride and how the thing looks at the end of the day, I'm afraid. It depends on the type of animals too and how tough they are to keep in where we want them to be. But basically, if I run the numbers on the average of that data set and say, righto, there's plenty of room for movement, but you know, for whatever reason, people are spending about $100 a hectare on a subdivision. What's the benefit? And you've got to bear with me a little bit here, because again, I could spend an hour running you through how I converted the grass into dollars, but ultimately I went through the data and worked out what is the return from an animal unit. And based on that return from an animal unit, whether it's a sheep, a cow-calf unit, or a growing steer, and average that out, I come up with $20 a hectare, $9 an acre. So the cost of doing this thing, in this case being subdivision, has been, you know, $100 a hectare, $40 an acre. The benefit in the actual grass consumed down the throat into an animal that then gets sold or produces a calf that gets weaned is very conservatively $20 a hectare or $9 an acre in the first year. Okay, so that's making some assumptions there about a 600 mil rainfall zone, which plenty of people are going to be above or below, which is 24 inches. And it's a very conservative price on the value of dry matter, $60 a tonne, 6 cents a kilo, 2 cents a pound, which is well below market rates for going and buying that dry matter off the shelf from the reseller. So it's actually a pretty conservative rate of return. But I did that specifically because I just wanted to be ultra conservative here and say, if I was just Joe Average and I went and subdivided a paddock, what could I expect to receive? And the answer is 20% return on my dollar invested, which is pretty cool. So that's the average. Like I said, I'll just quickly show that there's a lot of people doing much better than average. If I went and picked out a bunch of different paddocks that are above average, we're seeing in the order of 100% increase in grass per unit of precipitation. As I said, a very honest way of looking at change. And that's where they're increasing density significantly above that kind of 4 cows per hectare basis that we're looking at before. They're getting well up into the 60 to 70 head per hectare or 25 to 30 head per acre zone. And I won't bog you down in the detail here, but we're seeing returns and increases in grass yield in the order of 100%, which means that if I spend my $100 a hectare, well, then I'm actually looking at getting that back in the first year, and then subsequent gains are in the bank for no return, for no cost. And so I'll wrap up by saying, that's great. That's fantastic. That gives us a cost. And if I'm really, cost conscious, I know I can do much better than $40 an acre or $100 a hectare to subdivide a paddock. What about if I just use single wires and just get the job done? And I'm putting this data up here just as a really good reminder and hopefully opener to the fact that this isn't just about the return through the animal in the short term. Those paddocks I'll put up in the previous slide have gone through a program of intensification, so much higher graze densities through subdivision, real high density, long recovery grazing. And it's one of the few farms that has done a very comprehensive soil carbon assessment. It's one of the best in the world at the moment. And the only paddock in that set of data there that went down in carbon is called bottom juncture, and it's the green line there. And it was the only paddock in that data set that was not subdivided prior to this data set being collated. So very telling that that we're not just getting an economic value and an economic benefit from seeing grazing management refined through higher densities, but it's actually showing up in the soil with increases in soil carbon, which then means increases in natural capital value on the property, which is pretty meaningful, pretty exciting, and that's the stuff that we really want to get our teeth into. That's a big reason for getting into this, and that's a great segue into where Jim's going to take you now. So I'm just being told there's a question or two, so I'll wrap up there. But I just wanted to say, don't overdo the fence, right? The data here is telling us that there's something in this. We kind of knew it. We've seen it in the paddock. We've never had a good look at the data. Having done that, this is a whole new subject that deserves a lot bigger investigation, and we're going to go and do that. So I'll just answer that question now. And the question is, do those numbers include water infrastructure, Bart? Yeah, so yeah, I've rounded out those costs as being water and wire, and obviously people spend different amounts on just wire and where they don't need the water, and some do a much bigger job on the water in terms of troughs or tanks and troughs and pipes and everything else. But yeah, I've rounded it out as an average, which includes both the water and the wire. And it just goes to show, the more data I've looked at, the more opportunity there is to spend a bunch of money too, because people do tend to do things so that it looks really nice. And I guess that's actually happening because they're not aware or sensitive to the impact that has on the margin. And I know I'll be a lot more sensitive to the margin in terms of how pretty my fence is now when I'm thinking about subdivisions, because every extra cost I put into the subdivision is actually going to dilute the margin that I'm up for by taking that action. And I'm not giving people a hard time there. I've done it myself. We all love fences that look pretty. So on that note, I'll wrap up. But it really does raise the question: why do people not do more subdivision? You know, really. I mean, how many opportunities in farming are there to make 20% return on your dollar? How many opportunities are there to pay for something in 5 years, just being average, let alone really good? It's kind of crazy. And I suspect the answer to that question is that an absence of data kind of means that it's been anecdotal, and that this warrants a much closer, thorough investigation to really take it out there and really hammer the point to a lot of folks that are underdoing what they could be. And as we started off the conversation with, you know, they're looking to buy next door when really they can significantly improve the production at home without needing to go to the bank. So on that, I'll wrap up. Obviously a lot more to talk about there, and I'm looking forward to more webinars about that and going deeper into that now that we've opened the door on that little subject. And thank you, Jim, for making that anecdote with those people that got me thinking about it. So I'll wrap up there. Thanks, folks.
Before we get underway, I want to thank MaiaGrazing for putting this program together. A few words about how I became associated with Maia. It was a little over a year ago that I was first exposed to the program. Carl Phelan contacted me, but the things that Maia can do in terms of record keeping, feed budgeting, forecast stocking rates, I'd been looking for a program, for really 20 years that would do this. And so as I've gotten involved, I'm really excited with the things that, Bart was talking about. And by the way, Bart, thanks for all the flattery, but it wasn't needed. So I've always been a data-driven person. I spent 20 plus years in academic research in grazing systems. I've been almost 40 years in the ranching business. And this is an exciting time. So we're going to get started in this series of webinars, and I look forward to doing more in the future, cooperating with the MaiaGrazing team. But the topic that I wanted to start with is this idea of creating excellent pastures. And what I've learned over this almost 40 years of grazing management as a farmer and rancher is an increasing appreciation of the role of soil. Let's start now by thinking about what is excellent pasture. And I am talking more about pasture. And in the US, in our vernacular, there is a difference between pasture and rangeland. I'm using the term pasture. Most of what I'm saying is applicable to rangeland. Basically, the way in the US we differentiate between pasture and rangeland. Rangeland is predominantly native species growing in a precipitation environment, I would say, of less than 18 inches or so of rainfall. So, what is that, 450 mils, something like that? Pasture is predominantly introduced species in an environment with more than 18 inches of precipitation. So that's how we differentiate it. As I talk about what is excellent pasture, pretty well we can apply these same things in terms of what is excellent rangeland. Animal performance is, certainly during the growing season, is driven primarily by energy intake. So we want a pasture that is high in energy. And I say adequate in protein. The high legume content pasture that I have in that picture on the right, we could potentially have excess protein to the detriment of animal performance there. If we have high in energy, adequate in protein. Next characteristic I have is mineral rich. 20 years ago, I did not give near the emphasis to minerals, both in the human diet and in our livestock diet, that I do now. As I've become more experienced with my own health and with the health of livestock, I've really seen the value of having appropriate minerals in the diet. We like pasture and rangeland to be species diverse. That diversity is what can contribute a great deal to the mineral richness of the diet. And it also gives us forages that are high in energy at different times of the year, adequate to high in protein at different times of the year. The fifth item I have listed there is palatable. Now, we used to think that palatable just meant, hey, it tastes good, animals like to eat it. The work that Fred Provenza at Utah State and many of his colleagues around the world have done over the last 20 years, that tells us that palatability is much more about metabolic feedback loops within the animal. It isn't about just does it taste good, it is how the animal metabolically responds to what's being consumed. And then the final thing I have is durable. It is expensive to reseed pastures. It is expensive to try to adjust the environment to allow particular plant species to live in your environment when they're not adapted and they're non-natives. So we want, if we are seed pasture, we want something that's going to be very persistent in our environment. Excellent pasture, it's not going to happen by accident. It has to be created through our management. What is not excellent pasture? Bare ground, consistently being grazed too short, low vigor plants, inadequate species diversity, and this all leads to depleted soil life below and dysfunctional mineral cycles. And once again, this type of pasture doesn't just happen randomly. It is created by people. It is management choices that's going to determine whether you have excellent pasture, horrible pasture, or all those different things that might be in between. To create excellent pasture, I've got the management objectives listed on the left there, and the strategies we use to accomplish them on the right. There's very few things in agriculture that I ever talk about maximizing. I almost always am talking about optimizing. But I don't see any downside whatsoever to maximizing photosynthesis. So that becomes our objective. A little bit later on, I'm going to talk about the role of photosynthesis and energy flow to the soil, but we want to optimize energy flow to the soil. We want to create biodiversity above and below ground. This is going to create additional stable organic matter in the soil, and that's going to be beneficial for our water cycles and our nutrient cycles. So the basic strategies that we're using in management, and Bart has already talked about the importance of subdividing pastures and increasing animal density. More and more, as years have gone by, I have switched. When I talk to farmers and ranchers about subdividing pastures, I say, don't think about it only as subdividing space. What we are really doing is subdividing time. We're shortening the grazing period, because mostly negative things happen to the plant during the grazing period. Mostly positive things happen in the recovery period. So we use short grazing periods. We leave appropriate post-grazing residual. We allow adequate recovery. If we use these tools effectively, it's going to broaden the biodiversity of our plant community, as well as our total biota out there. And that's what strengthens our soil health. So in my view, these are the keys to creating excellent pasture. And these are the things we need to focus our efforts on. I've mentioned healthy soils a few times already now. So let's think about what constitutes healthy soils. There are three components of the soil that we put emphasis on and we talk about. And I'm going to look at this a little bit chronologically. If we think about the research that was done, the science that was developed in the first half of the 20th century, it had a lot to do with soil fertility, or the chemical composition of the soil. When we talk about nutrients or the chemical composition, there's two thought processes we go through. One is what is commonly termed the sufficiency level of a nutrient in the soil, and that simply means, is there enough of this particular mineral to support the level of plant production that we're hoping for? And then we have this question of balance of minerals. We know, and particularly among some of the micronutrients, that there is antagonism between minerals in terms of competition for binding sites on the soil colloids. So the chemical, excuse me. So we learned a lot about fertility of soils in the first half of the 20th century. The physical structure of the soil is another factor, and we spent a great deal of time in the second half of the 20th century learning about aeration in the soil, the movement of water. This is when we learned to do tile drainage, to put irrigation, sprinkler irrigation on top of the land. We know that physical structure is largely determined by the soil particle size, with sand being the coarsest particle, silt intermediate, and clay being the smallest. The third component of the soil is soil biology. And to put it in perspective, so I went to university for my undergraduate and graduate degrees in the 1970s. I had a soil microbiology class, and the two things that I remember are that nitrogen fixation is a wonderful process, and if it weren't for soil microorganisms decomposing corn stalks, Illinois would be buried under 40 foot of unrotted corn stalks. That's about what the level of understanding or interest in soil biology was. This is basically from the beginning of the 21st century. And I dare say that we have increased our understanding of soil biology 10 times more in the last 20 years than we did in the previous 200 years. It's an exciting time to be alive as a soil scientist if you are in the field of soil biology. And what we're interested in here is, are the soil organisms functioning properly? Do we have appropriate diversity of organisms? And then a term that I never heard, again, when I was in school in the 70s, soil microbial biomass. Yes, we talked about humus, we talked about organic matter, but soil microbial biomass, this is the living, breathing, functioning part of soil life. And this is the area that we're really expanding our knowledge of since we've come into the 21st century. So going back to the old concept of soil quality, again, 30, 40, 50 years ago, nobody talked about soil health. We did use the term soil quality. And when I was in school, I was taught this three-leg stool concept, that for the seat of the stool to be level, and this is where your farm or ranch is resting on that soil quality there, we had three legs of equal importance: the physical, the chemical, and the biological leg. Now, I look in my hindsight, 40 years hindsight, we way under, estimated the role of soil biology in this whole function. So we have evolved to a different view of the relationship of physical, chemical, and biological soil properties. Now we think of it as a pyramid, with biological function of the soil being the foundation of soil health, because soil biology modifies the physical structure of the soil, adding organic matter, adding living, functional biology to the soil greatly alters how just the physical aspect of sand, silt, clay relate. And soil chemistry, nutrient cycling, we now know that rather than just being physical processes in the soil, or physical chemical processes in the soil, nutrient cycling is largely driven by the biological functioning of the soil. So now where we are, rather than being focused on, oh, do I need to add this much fertilizer? Should I do this tillage? Should I apply this much water through the sprinkler? We now understand that if we manage for healthy functioning biology, a lot of the physical benefits kick into place, natural nutrient cycling takes over, and so the need for added fertility is greatly minimized if we have a living, functioning soil. Physics and biology, excuse me again. So just as an aside, I've got 6 grandkids these days. I was just down in Texas last week, where 3 of them are, and every one of them was sick sometime during the 9 days I was down there. And so I got a little bit of odd Texas grandkid cold going on. All right, so one of the basic principles in physics is for every action, there is an opposite and equal reaction. In the world of biology, we have to look at it differently, because for every action, there is a multi-directional reaction. This is where the idea of epigenetics comes into play. For many, many, many years, from an evolutionary perspective, we've understood that the environment creates the organism. What we failed to understand for a long time is that the organism modifies the environment on an ongoing basis. And the clearest illustration of this is human beings as one of the organisms, and how much we are changing the environment where we and all these other creatures live. So each time we do some action out in our pasture or on the landscape, we cannot expect the same result, because the very management action that we imposed on a biological system altered that system, which in turn is altering the environment in which it exists. And so the response is going to change over time. This is what we need to understand. It is what industrial agriculture has completely failed to understand and deal with. I think everyone in the listening audience understands that photosynthesis is the source of almost all energy on this planet. You know, basically we know in the air, water from the soil, in the presence of solar energy, in the chloroplast and the plant leaf, we have this wonderful process where solar energy is converted into a chemical energy form, and that chemical energy form is carbohydrates. It's created above ground. I think we all know that there's a part of the plant and a bottom part of the plant. Photosynthetic energy captured on top of the plant feeds the root system. The root system can grow and exist only in the context of how much energy is being supplied from the plant above. We were taught a long time ago that plant roots grow, they die, they're decomposed by soil organisms, and energy is released from this. Minerals are released back into the soil so they can be taken up by the plant again. What we didn't understand until much more recent times is that within 48 hours, 30 to 60% of carbon from photosynthesis flows through the root system into the soil to feed microbial life. The idea that only after a plant dies do microbes work on it to decompose is completely inaccurate. There is a living, ongoing interaction between the soil microbes of the rhizosphere and the plant roots. Mycorrhizal fungi are, one of the best understood. And by that, it means we probably understand 5% of what mycorrhiza do, compared to less than 1% of what all the bacteria and actinomycetes and protozoans are doing. But the mycorrhizal fungi serve as an extension of the plant's root system that enhances both nutrient and water uptake. The mycorrhizal fungi interact with other bacteria, mycorrhiza, for the transport of other minerals to the plant. There is an ongoing economy below ground that we cannot see, but it is an economy that is critical to the long-term profitability of our farms and ranches. And the more we understand and increase our understanding of that relationship between plants and between living plants and living microbes in the soil, the better job of management we can do. So I said photosynthesis is the one thing that I say, hey, let's maximize it. And here's why. Not only do we increase plant production per acre or hectare, we are going to carry more animals on that, as Bart has already pointed out. So we have greater animal carrying capacity on that land. And the new addition to this is we are building more soil and more soil life. So our objective was to create living soil, biologically active soil with good function. So if we're going that direction, and hopefully we achieve it, question becomes, how do we keep it alive? I'm just going to hit on a few items here. Hopefully I'll offend a few people. I always say, I never try to offend anyone unintentionally. The eternal ripple effect is back here again. Everything is linked together. And here's, hey, this is from Australia. Look at that. This was the first paper that I'm aware of, 2007, Lawrence and Vadakadu, who really discussed the role of living biology in agricultural systems. And in this publication, this is one of the things they stated. Soils under native remnant vegetation had significantly higher microbial diversity than other systems, followed by pasture-based systems. The lowest diversity was found in crop paddocks, and in this case, that was wheat and barley. And so we have to ask ourselves, why do we have healthy, functional biology under native vegetation, and we don't on farmland? What is it that we do different on farmland? Well, one of the first things that comes to mind is tillage. Oh, we also apply various pharmaceuticals for crop growth. And as we have delved deeper into these inputs and their role in a broader ecological sense, we've begun to learn some things. Back to this pyramid concept. Let's think about, where do we spend our money? We line soils, we apply fertilizer, we do tillage, we do drainage. We spend a lot of money in conventional farming practices on these inputs. What do we do expense-wise to benefit the biology? Now, unfortunately, a lot of the things that we're doing, particularly tillage, and I would add draining soils excessively, are negative impacts on the biological components of the soil. We can think about the pharmaceuticals that we add. So Roundup, this is, I call it a myth. We were told this for years and years and years, and we're learning that it's not true. We were told Roundup and its metabolites are benign in the soil. Well, actually, it's been known as early as 1991 that glyphosate in soil was having negative effects on soil bacteria, fungi, and invertebrates. We didn't learn this in, Crop Science Journal or something like that. That's released in court documents in 2015. There are a lot of lawsuits, probably some valid, some invalid, claiming human ill health from exposure to glyphosate. It took that kind of lawsuit to bring internal documents from Monsanto indicating research almost 30 years ago that glyphosate was in fact not healthy for soils. We were also told it only attacks a metabolic pathway found in plants, thus it is perfectly safe for animals. The reality is we mammals have bacteria living in our guts that are an important part of our digestive process and immune systems and mental health. And the same shikimic acid pathway that occurs in plants that's affected by glyphosate exists in those microbes in our guts. And it's saying now that it's really not all that safe. Okay, so I have come to the point in life where I cannot spray herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, parasiticides on soils or livestock. And the simplest way that I explain this is herbicide rhymes with suicide. Insecticide rhymes with homicide. Fungicide rhymes with genocide. Parasiticide rhymes with regicide. Side means death. If we accept that the soil is a living, breathing organism, how can it make sense to apply death to it? Here's another one. How would we know that killing parasites on the backs of cattle would affect the soil phosphorus cycle? And, I did my share of pouring Ivomec on animals, thought it was a wonderful product. But the question we failed to ask was, what's the ripple effect? It is death. Why did we think that it wouldn't cause death in other parts of the ecosystem? To me, the more important question is, why do the cattle have parasites? A principle that it took me a long time to learn, but I kind of adhere to now, is this one, that you will always get what you manage for. If your livestock have parasites, the question is, what are you doing in your management that causes that to happen? How can we change management and eliminate that effect? Remember, when it comes to biology, everything is linked together, and every action that we take will have ripple effects that we never considered. You know, back to this question of energy flow to the soil, let's come back to the thinking about the role of diversity. Every one of these plants that we might have in our native range or native pasture community has a different rooting structure associated with it. And all of these different rooting structures create different effects in the soil. And when it comes to microbial species, more species specific. We look at other microbial aspects of the rhizosphere, and we find that some are species specific, some are very broad in their applications, but what we know now is the more diversity we have above ground in our plants, the greater the structural plant below the ground is going to be, and that leads to greater microbial diversity in the soil, which, as I said, is key to nutrient cycling. I haven't even touched on the checks and the natural checks and balances for pathogenic organisms, whether those be insects, fungi, bacteria. The greater the diversity of plants we have and the biology below the soil, the fewer animal afflictions, the fewer plant diseases, the fewer insect plagues that we're going to have. Let's think about the total benefits that we're looking for plant diversity in the pasture. It starts with photosynthesis. The greater plant diversity we have, the more likely there's going to be something green and growing more days of the year. That allows us to capture more solar energy, thus more forage production. If we have diversity of C3 plants, C4 plants, forbs, grasses, legumes, we're more likely to have more uniform seasonal forage production. That's going to give us better balanced nutritional quality more days of the year, better wildlife habitat. And I know in the U.S., marketing wildlife off of is big business, and it's sometimes a bigger profit center than what the cattle operations on those ranches are. But when I say wildlife habitat, I'm not speaking only of these big game species that we hunt. I'm talking about the birds, the bees, the pollinators, all of these organisms that make positive contributions to ecological stability and soil health. Now, ecological stability means of the plant community to respond to disturbances, fires, floods, plagues of locusts of biblical proportion. The greater our biodiversity, the greater the ecological stability. Going back to the 2007 paper from CSIRO, there's another thing they said in here. In low fertility soils, microbial diversity and biological activity depend on the quantity and quality of carbon input from plants. This is the beginning of the research that has led to this understanding of the direct flow of active photosynthetic energy almost immediately to soil biology. Everything is hooked together. We change one thing, we change everything. So, as I mentioned, above ground diversity creates below ground diversity. We need to be aware of that life that's there. We need to implement management practices that encourage the microbial, the insect, the invertebrate diversity below ground. It is those microbial relationships that allow native plant communities to thrive without fertilizers. It isn't that they just have lower requirements than tame pastures. It's because we're far more likely to have functional biology in a perennial grassland system. And that functional biology leverages much more effective nutrient cycling. Cow poops, the more biologically active that soil is, the more rapidly it's going to break down. So let's think about nutrient cycling for a little bit. In grasslands, we might graze those, we might harvest them for hay or silage. In every situation, we have inputs, we have exports. In between those, we have this black box mystery that we just call, well, that's the nutrient cycle. I want you to think about hay or silage, but think in terms of harvested forage and what happens there. When we physically remove the entire plant, above ground portion of the plant, we're leaving a stubble there, but 80% of the mineral nutrients and nitrogen in that hay is going to be removed. If you sell hay or silage from your property, it's an extractive mining process and you're shipping nutrients away. The long-term effect is diminished productivity. This is what, just in terms of NP and K, this is typically what we think of as being in a ton of hay. And again, my apologies that I didn't go through everything as graciously as Bart did and put imperial and systems international measurements in it. These amounts aren't important. It's the comparison that I'm going to draw in a couple of slides that's important. So a ton of hay contains 40 to 60 pounds of nitrogen, 6 pounds of elemental P, 40 to 50 pounds of potassium. 3 tons contains 3 times that much. Why am I using 3 tons? Because I go a lot of places in the US and say, hey, what's your hay yield? Oh, it's about 3 tons per acre. And what I want you to register now is those numbers in the 3-ton yield. 150 pounds of nitrogen, 40 pounds of phosphate, 150 pounds of potash. If we take a field that is capable of producing 3 tons of hay, graze it with growing beef steers or heifers, and we'll have them gaining about 1 3/4 pounds a day, or that'd be 3/4 to 0.8 kilos. So it's a decent rate of gain. If we manage them effectively to produce that much gain, and by managing effectively, I'm going to be rotating them every day, we should produce about 500 pounds of beef per acre. So 3 tons of hay, 500 pounds of beef per acre are equivalent yields. We have exports out of the grazing system, right? We're selling calves, we put weight gain on our beef animals, we have loss pathways. But the point is 90% of what goes in the front end of a cow comes out the back end. So rather than physically carrying the plants away, we harvest it with the animals through dung and urine. Minerals are being put back out there. This is what walks off the field at 500 pounds of beef. About 16 pounds of nitrogen, so roughly 10% of what a hay crop removes, 10 pounds of phosphate, so about 25% of what the hay crop removes, less than 2 pounds of potash, so less than 1% of what a hay crop removes. We could do this for the calcium, magnesium, zinc, copper, cobalt, sulfur, every other mineral out here is in a grazing system. Most of the minerals are being returned to the soil, whereas in a harvested system, they're being moved off of that field. This is and this is a very simplified view of the phosphorus cycle, but this is the old view. There's plants available soil phosphorus. Plants take it up almost universally as phosphate. Animals can, in the plants, that phosphorus is being incorporated into various plant chemicals. The livestock consume it, they excrete it. The more mature the forage is, the more of that phosphorus is going to be bound to indigestible or slowly digestible fibers. Most phosphorus is excreted in feces. Very little comes out in urine, cow poops, mineralization, the breakdown from organic to inorganic forms by soil microorganisms, and then we have lost pathways of erosion and runoff. As I said, that's the old view of the phosphorus cycle. The new view, and I don't know where my plants went here, they disappeared. Now, the current view is that there is phosphorus being extracted from this decomposing manure pile by living organisms. It's held by those microbes, transferred via mycorrhizal fungi back to the plants. Why do we have to keep putting phosphorus fertilizer onto our pastures? If we have used, if they're crop rotation pastures to where we grow row crops, have a couple years of pastures, we do not have functional mycorrhizal there. Tillage destroys mycorrhiza, and it takes a minimum of 3 to 4 years for those populations to reestablish themselves in the soil. So if we are absent mycorrhizal fungi in the soil, we have to rely much more on phosphorus fertilizer, which increases the expense of, well, there's that grass. Okay. So one of our concerns in nutrient cycling becomes what controls or determines the rate at which manure is going to be decomposed. It's fiber digestibility, moisture and temperature, microbial and physical disturbance. So the physical disturbance that I'm talking about isn't going out with a tool and dragging manure around in the pasture, a harrow, a drag, whatever you call it. We're talking about insects, birds, natural components of the ecosystem tearing these piles apart to accelerate the rate of movement into the soil. Where we have healthy bird populations, healthy dung beetles, very often manure piles are largely vanished within 3 to 5 days of the SCE, which is a single excretory event. Earthworms below ground further take some of that material, process it through their bodies, take it deeper into the soil. But the whole point is the more living activity in the soil, the faster things are going to happen. So manure from high quality pasture decomposes faster. Why? Because there's less indigestible fiber. If the rumen microbes could not digest the fiber and we're getting cow pies out that are stacked up, 6, 8 inches tall, it's because of high levels of indigestible fiber in the diet. If the rumen microbes couldn't decompose it, the soil microbes don't do much better job. So if we manage our livestock in such a way that they're generally consuming higher quality pasture, nutrient cycles are going to turn faster. This is, kind of gee whiz numbers from some different locations in the U.S. Of decomposition rate of manure piles. Louisiana, which is in the southern U.S., next to the Gulf of Mexico, almost subtropical environment. For manure piles to be fully broken down, minerals fully incorporated back into the soil, 3 to 6 months is what they say. In Missouri, where I worked for many years, which is a temperate, humid climate, 2 to 3 years. If you look at our rangeland out in this mountainous country back here, we live just under 2,000 meter elevations. That's about 6,000 feet. Our cattle graze all the way up to about 9,500 foot elevation. That's 3,000 meters. It's cold up there and it's dry, and it takes 25 to 30 years for a manure pile to break down. When we think about the nitrogen cycle, it's a little more dynamic than the phosphorus cycle. A big factor here that I want to bring up is the volatile loss of ammonia, particularly from cow urine, but we also lose some from feces as well. And it is our vegetation management, soil surface management that largely determines what the degree of volatilization will be. If we follow that cycle just a little bit here. Again, using our 3-ton yield example with 150 pounds of nitrogen in it, the animals are going to retain less than 15% of it. So at a minimum, we'd expect about 135 pounds of excretion. Now we're showing volatile losses 15 to 75 pounds. We can easily lose over 50% of the nitrogen from urine when we have bare soil that's catching direct sunlight, heating up that soil. Soil temperature is a big factor in accelerating volatile loss. So we want to keep the soil covered, keep it cooler. The greater the alkalinity of the soil, the greater the volatilization loss will be. This is some work published many years ago relating the soil temperature 1.2 inches, so that's 3 centimeter depth, and the percent of urine being volatilized. This one's only running up to 25%. This is probably a pretty healthy soil cover situation. As I said, many times it's 50, 60, 70% volatile nitrogen loss when we're not doing a good job of soil management. Nitrogen fixation is a big deal. I am a strong proponent of having a healthy legume component in all of our pastures. We're generally looking for 30, 40, even up to 50%, depending on the environment and the particular legume we're talking about. But we like 30, 40% of the biomass production coming from the legume component. These are nitrogen fixation rates in terms of pounds per acre fixed per year. These are substantial numbers. If the alternative is purchasing nitrogen fertilizer, these high levels of nitrogen fixation here are, in our current market, would be in excess of $100 per acre nitrogen fertilizer cost. If we can get that from a legume component in the pasture, which is also contributing to the diversity and greater microbial life and diversity below ground, it's a very positive factor. This next set of slides is going to bring us to looking at the effect of stock density on the nitrogen distribution in a pasture. So we're going to look at 3 levels of protein in the diet: 10, 15, 20%. 10%, we'll say that's a straight cool season grass pasture. 15% is that cool season grass with a 30 to 40% legume component, and 20% is going to be a high legume content pasture. We have 1,200 pound cows eating 2.6% of the body weight. We just go through the calculation, and what we find is that on this diet at 10% protein, the animals are going to be excreting about half a pound of nitrogen per day. On the grass and legume pasture, 7/10, and just short of a pound on the high nitrogen pasture or high legume pasture. Now, as the protein content of the diet increases above the requirement of the animal, pretty well all excess then is excreted in urine. Fecal nitrogen levels are pretty constant. All excess is coming as urine, and urine is an almost immediately available high potency nitrogen fertilizer. So we're mostly concerned about the distribution of urine on the pasture. So I've adjusted these excretion rates by subtracting out the constant fecal nitrogen. So now per cow, we're looking at about 1/4 pound, half a pound, or 3/4 pound a day nitrogen excretions. Now here's where stock density comes into play. And I'm going to jump to this next slide because it describes a 600 pound stock density would be continuous grazing at a stocking rate of 1 cow per 2 acres, the 1,200 continuous grazing a cow per acre. Now, as we start subdividing pastures and increasing the animal concentration there, the stock density there, we see a big shift in the amount of nitrogen being concentrated on that limited area where the animals are. If we roll into the fact that set stocking with greater travel distances to water magnifies the transport of nitrogen towards the watering point and not returning it uniformly out across the pasture, these small numbers are even smaller. What we see at these higher stock densities, and these are what we typically achieve on tame pastures in environments where we are receiving in excess of 20 inches of precipitation a year. Certainly, these would be the 48,000, the 96,000 pound stock density per acre. Those are numbers we would expect in environments with 30 plus inches of natural precipitation or under irrigation. Whereas the nitrogen contribution on a per acre basis is negligible and meaningless at these low stock densities. We get to the higher stock densities, and these are significant and meaningful rates of nitrogen return. This is why very often at high stock densities, what some people in the US call mob grazing, we see very rapid recovery of the pasture. Pretty well, it's just straight up nitrogen fertilizer response. All right, now here's where our problem is. As I said, with continuous grazing, we very often see a disconnect between where the animals are ingesting their feed and where they are excreting it. They're typically putting it out near water tanks, under shade, preferred animal resting spots based on air movement, things like that. How serious is this? In hot, humid climates, and this is work research we did in Missouri, measuring manure distribution over many years, looking at effects of shade and water. If the animals are walking more than a quarter of a mile, that's 1,320 feet or about 400 meters, up to 65% of manure ends up at shade and water. That, again, is a huge extractive mining effect where we're taking nutrients from large parts of the pasture, concentrating it in limited area. In a rangeland environment, what we see is 50% of manure ends up within 1 to 200 yards or 1 to 200 meters of the water tank when that travel distance is half to 3/4 miles, which is going to be 800 to 1,200 meters. Another set of gee whiz numbers. We did not count manure piles for 27 years. We had to do some, calculation of distribution, but we did count in grazing cells with 14-day grazing periods, 4-day grazing periods, and 1 day. And we found that we could get 1 pile per square yard or 1 pile per meter in 1 to 2 years with single-day rotation. If we moved them twice a week, it would take 4 to 5 years to get every square meter, square yard hit with a manure pile. 7 to 8 years in bi-weekly rotation. So in this type of grazing management, we had very little need to apply any phosphorus fertilizer back to the system, but we needed every 2 to 3 years in these other systems to add phosphorus fertilizer to keep the system production. Okay, so how do we create living, biologically active soils? First thing we do is then tillage. Tillage is the greatest enemy of soil life that there is. If you are a mixed crop and livestock farmer, no-till is, a great strategy to accelerate soil life. Limit monoculture cropping. Colin Seiss from Australia there is really, really popular speaker in the US. When he comes over here and talks about the pasture cropping, or what over here we're tending to call the no-kill cropping system, where we grow grain crops without disturbing the soil other than simply the slot of the no-till drill. Eliminate insecticides. Insecticides are very detrimental to a lot of non-target organisms. I say minimize herbicides. I think basically insecticides, fungicides, livestock parasite control are the chemicals, the pharmaceuticals that are really hurting soil life. Yes, some of the herbicides have been shown to have deleterious effects. Others very minimal. So I'll say minimize here. I'm not going to use them myself, but you got my blessing if you want to go ahead and do it. Judicious use of fertilizers. Excess nitrogen fertilizer, we have known for many years, reduces the symbiotic effect of rhizobia bacteria with the legumes. So we shied away from doing it in that situation. What we didn't know until more recently is that high levels, and by high levels, I'm going to say in excess of 40 to 50 pounds per acre, so 40 to 50 kilograms per hectare of phosphate is detrimental to the function of mycorrhizal fungi. If the plant can get phosphorus through a bare root without feeding carbohydrates to soil microbes, in sense of economic efficiency, they're going to try to do that. As we've come to learn that more micronutrients are also transported through the mycorrhizal system, researchers have actually found higher levels of phosphorus fertilizer are inducing micronutrient deficiencies in various crops because of stopping the mycorrhizal fungi. The long crop rotations that we used to do, I grew up a crop farmer in Illinois, and when I was a teenager, we were still doing 7-year crop rotations with 2 row crops followed by a small grain and then 4 years of perennials. That 4 years of perennials is what allowed the mycorrhizal to reestablish, increase plant species diversity. Again, this is where cover crop, mixed crop and livestock systems on our pasture and range. We just want to work towards increasing plant diversity. Livestock can be used as soil inoculators. Most cropping soils are deficient in microbial life, and there is some crossover between ruminant livestock and soil organisms. So bringing livestock from healthy pastures onto cropland is a way to inoculate the forages. Okay, so that's my information for tonight. Here is contact information. I will say something about our business. Well, I guess Carl, is doing that, has been doing that in the advertising. But yeah, we are American Grazing Land Services. And besides the educational programs that I do, we also do retail product sales of electric fencing, stock water supplies, forage seed, and we work with our clients and customers to also get them using the MaiaGrazing system as well. So Carl, I'll turn it back to you.
Look, thanks, Jim. Thanks, Bart. I think I'm back on the mic now. Some really great thought-provoking presentations there. I can see that we've still got pretty much everyone on the webinar, which is just wonderful to see from all around the world. So I appreciate people hanging in. Some questions have come through. We've probably got time for 2 or 3, and then for all of the rest of them, we'll ensure that we get some personal responses back, including in the recording of the webinar, so everyone will have the opportunity to see the answers. But the first one was from James in Saskatchewan. Bart, loved your presentation, man. Awesome to see some data. What's the minimum graze density required to achieve a yield increase? So Bart, I might throw that to you.
Thanks, Cole. Yeah, James, a great question, and I did mean to actually expand on that, and I think there's another webinar just in that one question, to be honest, because it's a crucial question, and we're in the process of building out regression models on that very thing. So I will throw out there that the number I'm looking at, what it looks like to me is it's around sort of 40 to 50 DSE per hectare, bare minimum. It's really more like, in terms of, this is from a small subset of farms that I've dove into quite closely, and it needs broader looking at. But basically, we're looking at around about 40 to 50 head per hectare. Take that back to 25 to 30 per acre to really get that animal impact and that incremental or significant change in ecological state. So it's a great point, because if I go and spend money subdividing but I don't get the density, then have I done my dough and actually wasted my time? And I think the answer is up to a point. That's right. There is a threshold at which we must get over enough impact to actually make a difference. So yeah, thanks for the question.
Thanks, Bart. The next one, Jim, this is for you, from Matthew in the central west of New South Wales here in Australia. Jim, this all sounds good, but I'm in severe drought. As many people on the call are also. Received less than half my annual rainfall, and it's so dry I can't see any biological activity surviving. So what's the single most important thing that I can do to rebuild after the drought ends?
I would say that after the drought ends, and well, first I would have to ask, how much did you destock? One of the great things that Maia helps you do is see that drought coming before it happens. So if you have to stock to an appropriate level, and when the drought breaks and you begin restocking, is make sure you're doing that at a conservative enough level that you're going to be able to leave adequate post-grazing residual. And adequate post-grazing residual, yeah, that does certainly depend on the environment that you're in. You know, very often we'll say, take half, leave half. Well, if your total annual forage production is only 600 kilograms per hectare, take half, leave half is excessive grazing. You're probably going to want to take 20, leave 80 to ensure that you can get cover back on the ground, because you have to have biology feeding the soil to get that soil life coming back.
One other question, there's quite a few more, but if people are hanging on, please, and it seems as though they are, we've probably got time for one or two more, but then we'll wrap things up and ensure that everyone gets the rounded out feedback and answers. But the other one was, here we are, Sarah in Eastern Texas. This is one for both you, Bart and Jim. What is the ideal stock density to get a change from high impact grazers? I'm running herds of 500 steers swinging through pastures. I've reduced down to 20 acres, but not seeing shifts. Bart, we might start with you, and then Jim, if you could respond as well.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Cole. Look, I'm just trying to grab those numbers. It was 500 steers through, what's it, 20 acres?
Yeah, through 20-acre pastures, but not seeing the expected shifts.
Yeah, I totally get the question. It's a good start. It's a great shift. You're obviously increasing stocking density and making a difference there, but that does boil down to being not enough impact for that ecology and that system. And it probably depends somewhat on the rainfall and the resilience of the soils and so on. But that's just telling you that you've got to incrementally go until you get that animal impact transferring into a change in state. And at around that 10 steers per acre kind of deal, it's just not quite cracking it. So yeah, I'd be looking to go double or 3 or 4 times that if I could. It just depends on your water systems and the infrastructure that you're able to put into place, and just keep working towards that.
Thanks, Bart. So before you just go in to that, Jim, and give your response, for everyone who's asking these questions, and anyone else on the line, if you'd like to ask a personalised question through to either Bart, Jim, or anyone else here in the team at MaiaGrazing, feel free just to send through an email to the details that you see on the screen now, and we'll ensure that you get a personalised response. So don't feel as though you have to to send it through now. But Jim, if you'd be able to just respond to Sarah's question, Sarah from Eastern Texas, that'd be great.
All right. So stock density is controlled by 4 factors: the amount of feed you have, your target utilization rate, the intake requirement of the animal, and how long you're going to be there. By far and away, the overriding one is how much forage do you have out there available. If you move once a day, and I'm very familiar with East Texas, I would be probably looking at a stock density in the 50 to 90,000 pounds available forage per acre. That's the same as saying you would be harvesting 50 to 90 animal unit days per acre. It's going to depend on what the availability is there. At that level, that is where we expect to see significant changes taking place in your ecosystem. In some of our dryland clients, 8 to 10,000 is the most you could carry on a daily move. And, you know, so your target stock density to accomplish your goals in changing your basic ecosystem processes, there is not a magic number, universal level. It depends on those 4 factors.
Thanks so much, Jim. I'll just squeeze in one more. Somewhere again, you're probably quite familiar with the Southern Oklahoma. Says it's not terribly far from the Red River, due north of Dallas there. I love all the principles, Jim, but what's the ideal recovery period between graziers? I'm doing 50 days, but don't seem to be able to get out to what I keep hearing is needed, like 80 days plus. Do you have a response there?
Yeah, again, it of course depends on the environment. This will not apply to Bermuda grass, and where this gentleman's located, it might be Bermuda grass, but any of the cool season grass species, any of the tall growing native warm season or midgrass prairie plants of Central North America, when people ask me how long the recovery period should be, I would say the time it takes to grow 4 leaves. You know, it's just saying, you know, so many days is completely meaningless. What matters is on the species that you're managing for, recovery should allow for the growth of about 4 new leaves before it is grazed again.
That's great advice, Jim. It's not about the days. It's about what can be done in those days,
Exactly.
to the location and the species. So that's a very common question that many of us get asked all the time. So that's great. I'll squeeze a tiny little one, a bit of a statement, but a quick one for you, Jim, from actually a MaiaGrazing customer in southwest and Western Australia. Mycorrhizal fungi sounds awesome. How do I know if I've already got it, and of what state it's in?
Okay. The way you're generally going to determine that is actually by taking a soil sample and sending it to a lab that does biological assessments. We've got a number of them in the US. I'm sure you've got a few to several doing that in Australia. These samples do need to be handled very differently than something for chemical analysis. You cannot look at the soil and visibly see, you know, mycorrhizal for the most part. So getting a biological assessment is the best strategy.
Thanks so much, Jim. Look, for everyone on the call, thanks so much to Bart and Jim making that time available today. As you can see, details on the screen. If you'd like to find out what potentially MaiaGrazing could assist you with in terms of dynamically managing your stocking rate to carrying capacity, graze planning, replanting, forecasting, please arrange a private consultation with one of the MaiaGrazing if, arrange a personal demo. I'll be able to bring that page of upcoming bigger picture events that we're going to be involved in over the coming months. Please jump in and follow us on social media. We'd love to connect you like that. And we get asked to talk around the world fairly frequently along with Jim. So if there's any smaller localized events or webinars that we could put on for you and your groups, please let us know. There's endless topics that Jim and Bart can talk to. And thanks so much for your time. We look forward to the next Grazing Scholars webinar, and happy grazing. Thanks very much.